The aim of this session is to identify mentoring from a scholarly perspective in terms of research on mentoring practices, and in doing so to begin thinking about the why of mentoring as much as the what of mentoring. But before I begin the presentation, I would like to make it clear that I am by no means an expert on mentoring or the theoretical foundations of mentoring. My research interests are in teacher education and practice, and with this, of course, mentoring plays an important role. During the presentation, you may find yourself asking questions and contemplating your own experiences of mentoring. And I would suggest that perhaps you would like to hold on to those questions to frame what you will be asking the panel later on this afternoon. We won't have in this session time for a question and answer session, so hold on to any of those thoughts. So with all of that, let's begin. Okay, thinking about mentoring. Gilly Bolton identifies some descriptors of what it is to be a mentor. A role model, an enabler, a teacher, an encourager, counselor, befriender, facilitator, coach, confidant, and supporter in unlearning negative habits or attitudes. You may recognize some of those descriptors in your own experiences and practices. I want to pick up just very briefly on this notion of unlearning negative habits and attitudes, because that brings about certain connotations. For me, a mentor is a facilitator, helping the mentee to think about and articulate explicitly where they have come from, where they are at, and where they want to go to, and signposting that journey. Indeed, Alan Auer and colleagues frame mentoring much more than a process and look at it as a relationship. And as with all relationships, there will be moments of joy, hope, stagnation, frustration. And it's important as mentors that we recognize that these moments are perhaps inevitable in the whole process, and that we find ways to work through these stages together with the mentee. So, what do mentors do? Clutterbuck and Bengenson, don't you love those names? Clutterbuck and Bengenson are of the view that mentoring is a two-way process in making the implicit explicit. They say that mentors help mentees step outside the box of his or her job and personal circumstances, so they can look in at it together. It is like standing in front of the mirror with someone else who can help you see things about you that have become too familiar for you to notice. And indeed, again, Bolton suggests that mentors ask questions which one does not or cannot ask oneself. So here, Bolton's implying that being a mentor or a mentee may bring about interactions which challenge one's sense of self, values, beliefs, and attitudes. And some of the questions which arise through these interactions may be difficult to engage with. But it's important that such engagement does take place in order to appreciate the whole and not just the parts. Effective mentoring relationships, therefore, are built on trust, honesty, appreciation, and openness. And I will let you take just a short while just to reflect on some of those ideas before we move on to looking at some of the theoretical models which underpin mentoring experiences. So mentoring involves a dialogue, written or verbal, and action. Dialogue and action may be framed with and between various dimensions. And here, Bob Garvey and colleagues have identified some of those dimensions, a selection of which I'm presenting today. I've made mention already of mentoring as a journey, and across that journey, certain dimensions of inquiry will be in operation. So if we look first at the dimension of change and stability, do we look at mentoring through wanting to make changes to behaviour, to practices, out with the old, in with the new? Or do we frame it in terms of building upon what is already in place, enhancing what is there rather than making change? And along that dimension, when working with mentees, you may be closer to one side of the end of their dimension to another. Similarly, this notion of deficit and appreciative inquiry. Deficit is really looking at what is missing. Where is the gap? And how are those gaps going to be filled? Whereas appreciative inquiry focuses on what is in place and building on that alongside the deficits in the mentee's position. Dialogue can be framed around this notion of problem and solution. Problems often act as barriers. Starting with a problem as problems as a starting point are one way of focusing the dialogue, as opposed to focusing on solutions. The solutions gives one a top-down approach to the mentoring position rather than a bottom-up. So this notion of problem or solutions will be part of the mentoring process and engagement. Performance and whole life. Sometimes the mentoring focuses too much on the performance of the professional role and the professional aspirations, quite apart and not in recognition of the person as a whole being. How being a dance teacher is one part of a person's sense of self. And through examining those core personal constructs of a sense of self, one can begin to understand more clearly what it is to be a dance teacher and what it is that what their professional aspirations may be. One is very much connected with the other. This last dimension that I'm presenting today is quite interesting in terms of structure. This notion of rollout, devising clear objectives and timeframes for action, and the creeping in approach, which gives much more fluidity and potentially opens up opportunities that might not yet have been thought about. So, as mentors, it's important to remember that each mentoring relationship will be unique and not one size will fit all. Indeed, mentors need to be aware of which entry points for dialogue fits the professional, social and emotional needs of the mentee, which is predicated by a sense of knowing the other. Okay, moving on now to some of the modes of mentoring. Garvey and colleagues identify different modes of mentoring, and if we take a brief moment to look at each of these. The traditional dyadic mentoring, which was presented and explored in the 1970s by Daniel Levinson, perhaps forms one of the most commonly used mode of mentoring out there in the field. It is this notion of master and novice. The mentor acting as master with the experience and expertise and helping the mentee develop the same sorts of expertise and experience through an experiential and a experience of that drawn from the mentor, him or herself. Peer mentoring is generally where colleagues are on an equal footing to a certain extent, but drawing on Lev Vygotsky's concept of this zone of proximal development, one of the peers has a certain expertise, skill, knowledge or understanding that is slightly beyond that of their peer. And through an interaction and collaboration with the peers, the more knowledgeable other is able to mentor the other in developing whatever it is that they are being required to develop. Co-mentoring is where the relationship between the mentor and the mentee is very much more on an even keel. There is an equal relationship. There is no hierarchy of order or power relationship there. It's very similar to peer mentoring, but it is very much about learning from the other. Now, this is quite an interesting mode of mentoring, what Garvey refers to as e-mentoring. Now, at the time of writing his text, e-mentoring or technology for electronic communication really was in its infancy, and the thought that you could be able to develop a relationship through email and instant messaging was quite sort of, out there and unique. Now, of course, we have the facility of using Skype to have a much more personalized interaction through a social media base. And it will be interesting to see down the line how those interactions through Skype actually evolve within a mentoring context, the pros and the cons of that. The process of mentoring may move between these modes. Dyadic modes may shift to form peer mentoring when the mentee has a certain expertise or experience which the mentor does not have. And in my experience of mentoring, one of the joys of being a mentor is learning something that I hadn't realized from the person that I was mentoring. So it's important for mentors to have an awareness of the different modes in order to gain an appreciation of the potential for change in the interpersonal dynamics of mentoring relationships. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on looking at leadership because that's not the focus of today's event. But mentors do find themselves being placed in the role of mentor as they've been identified as leaders within their profession or within their field. Looking at leadership and the premises for mentoring is helpful in supporting and guiding the next generation of leaders. And if this is the case, then it is important to have an awareness of the typology of leadership. Grint presents the following ideas. Leadership as position. Is it where leaders operate that makes them leaders? Leadership as person. Is it who leaders are that make them leaders? Leadership as result. Is it what leaders achieve that makes them leaders? And leadership as process. Is it how leaders get things done that makes them leaders? And I think these are very important questions of mentors in reflecting on their own leadership characteristics. I'm a leader because, but also asking the question of mentees. I wish to become a leader because. And some of the responses to those questions may be underpinned by one or other of these descriptors. Now, if we look at the dimensions of problem solving and the rollout creep in, mentoring may involve the task of goal setting. And if you reflect on what you do as a mentor, you may already be engaging with this idea of goal setting. Mentors may feel compelled to set goals, as it's what the mentee expects. And indeed, setting goals is a way of being able to track and evidence progression and achievement of the mentee. So I'm not saying that goal setting doesn't have a place within the mentoring relationship, but what I am suggesting is that we need to be thinking about goal setting with a word of caution. More often than not, the setting of goals is done as an unconsidered routine. We need to do it, so let's just do it, without much more thought or contemplation beyond that. Sometimes the goals don't reflect the changing nature of life and the complexity of work. And this is, for me, quite crucial, because we do need, as mentors, to be aware and be able to facilitate shifting of the experiences of the mentee at any given time, and be willing to reframe those goals. So rather than having goal setting as a rigid framework, being prepared to seeing goal setting which is much more fluid in its process. Goal setting can actually sometimes be given in terms of satisfying a mentor's need for an illusion of control and competency, particularly if the dyadic mode of mentoring is in place. Mentors and mentees may not always be ready to set goals. Sometimes the goals are enforced rather than being authentically constructed. And this is similar to the notion of a readiness to learn. So too is there a readiness to set targets and goals. And perhaps more challenging, sometimes goals are superficial. It's the easy way out. And the goals avoid the deeper issues which underpin practice, understanding, contemplation, experience, etc. So I would encourage all mentors not just to ad hoc set goals with their mentees, but really think about what it is that one is doing when setting those goals, and thinking of goal setting as very much a collaborative engagement, just as it is a measure of progression and achievement. Now, for some of us, all of us, I should imagine, who have mentoring experiences, Merrick and Stokes identify 4 phases through which mentoring takes place, the development of mentoring. The novice mentor is when you first start. Can you think back to when you first were asked to mentor someone? You probably had some idea of the best practices. You may even have been fortunate enough to have received some sort of training on those best practices. But if I think about my own experience, it was very much trial and error and a discovery of what it was to become a mentor. The developing mentor has some experience, but is still learning the craft of mentoring. They are able to draw on effective strategies for mentoring much more easily and put these strategies into practice. The reflective mentor has extended their repertoire of skills and is able to reflect on these skills in relation to not only their own practice, but their practices the practices of other mentors. And that's why it's so wonderful that we're able to meet today and have a shared dialogue of our experiences and some of the challenges that we have met and how we have overcome those challenges in our mentoring experience. I would, however, argue that at any one time, a mentor might find themselves situated in more than one phase. For example, one may consider themselves to be at the reflexive mental stage, having engaged in mentoring over a number of years and with a wide range of mentees. One knows who he or she is as a mentor and is able to respond confidently to the statement, "I'm a mentor because." Then you are asked to mentor a new person, and with that new person, a new mentoring relationship transpires. And this relationship may challenge the ideals of best practice and a mentor's self-understanding of his or her role. The mentor, therefore, finds him or herself having to find new and undiscovered approaches to mentoring, some of which have not yet made the pages of texts, resources on mentoring as a process and as an activity. So think about where you may lie in any one given time in terms of this idea of the 4 stages of mentor development. Okay. Now, this next and concluding commentary is not related directly to mentorship, but is drawn from the work of Ron Barnett within the context of higher education. But the characteristics and qualities which he identifies have become for me something of a mantra, not only in my own professional practice, but certainly when I'm mentoring dance teachers. And you might find these qualities helpful when you think all is lost or you need some further inspiration of keeping that mentoring relationship alive. So Barnett identifies courage, to put one's claims forward as one's own and to be committed to those claims, to hit one note instead of several in the hope of one of them may be right. Bravery, to be prepared to open oneself to the new. Determination, to put things as clearly as possible, to follow things through to wherever they may lead. Persistence, to stick with things that may be clear only after some years of hard effort. Integrity, to be true to one's feelings and sentiments. And sincerity, so that one means what one says, and that what one says is an expression of one's own ideas. So I'm going to leave you with some of those thoughts, and remember, keep some of those questions that you have in mind. Hopefully they will frame some very good discussions later on this afternoon, and certainly after today, encourage you to think about your mentoring role from a theoretical position. So thank you very much.